So the Vampire Lestat is coming out in a week, and in preparation, I have decided to make this, so my thoughts on everything are fresh before watching. By God, I have a lot of thoughts. And also for your viewing pleasure. I did a third watch through of seasons 1 and 2 to make this, so big spoilers for seasons 1 and 2, obviously. I'm not going to mention anything about season 3 until the end, in case you don't want spoilers from the trailers that have been released so far. Alright, so starting off, I haven't read the books. I just started watching the show in October 2025. So, for all my knowledge on the books, I watched a ton of stuff from this person on TikTok who talks a lot about them. So, if I reference something from one of the books, then assume it's from her. But I'll try and be brief because I don't want to just repeat somebody else's ideas verbatim. I already know this video is not going to be nearly as popular as hers. So, if you watch Interview with the Vampire content, you've probably already seen her, but I like to cite my sources. Also, I'm not really interested in reading the books because I think it's more fun to just judge the show on its own, and I'm going into season 3 almost completely blind because of it, and I think that's more fun. Alright, so since this show is massively character driven, I've divided this video into sections based on all the main characters, so you can skip around a little bit if you're not interested in hearing what I have to say on all of them. The way I'm analyzing them is from a sort of semi-psychological perspective, because, like, I'll be honest, I took a total of 1 introductory psychology class, and by God, I'm gonna milk it for all it's worth. Also, yes, they're obviously characters, but I'm analyzing them almost like people, because there's a couple psychology methods that also help establish, like, central themes and stuff, and that just kind of felt like the most natural approach for me to take. Okay, so what methods? We've got 2 different methods that I'm using. First, with just Louis, we got the human development theory, specifically the idea from it that current human behavior can be explained based on how a person was raised. So basically, we can predict it. With the other characters, I'm loosely using Gordon Allport's trait theory. Google if you want more info on that. I'm not turning this into Intro to Psych lecture. But this basically helps establish a couple cardinal traits or themes that can help us contextualize how the characters behave. Before we get into that, though, I just want to, like, gush about some of the visual themes and motifs. They are so awesome. Like, look at these intro sequences. This is the opening for season 2, episode 1, and we got, like, World War II Europe with the planes at the top, and then modern day Dubai on the bottom. And obviously we know it's Dubai, but we can tell because it's got that thing. Then there are all the episode titles that are quotes that, like, establish the overarching theme of the episode, and then also, like, the overall themes when you tie them all together. Anyways, okay, so our first character is Louis Dupont Dulac. So the reason why we're using the human development theory for Louis is because he's basically the yapper for the first 2 seasons. I mean, he is the vampire. Every other character gets this treatment significantly less because we don't know enough about their backstory to do that. I mean, the Louis and Armand sections are probably the longest in this video because we learn the most about them. One of the only reasons I'm not doing the same thing with Armand is because I'm convinced that he's lying about at least half of what he's telling Daniel. I mean, Louis is also lying, but he's also lying to himself, and it's in a my brain has holes in it and I need therapy kind of way. Anyways, so I'm doing this with every other character as well, but let's establish some central themes about Louis' character. So let me start with an example, and then I'll explain how the themes I chose connect to it. I'll use this scene for when Lestat first sees Louis. So, in Dubai, Louis describes to Daniel how he's threatening Paul with a knife, and he defends it by saying, "You couldn't look weak on liberty." The interesting bit is that we can assume that Paul has done this before, and I think if people already know Louis on Liberty Street, then they probably also know his brother. Specifically that he has some kind of autism, childhood schizophrenia combo going on. Put that all into context, and add to the fact that Lestat can read minds. The first time he sees Louis, he is genuinely threatening to kill his mentally disabled brother in his place of business. And you wonder why Lestat was like, "I want that one." I'll get to him later. Anyways, Louis justifies his behavior in the present by saying he did what he did to survive, and that he was a rougher thing. And sure, he's rougher, but he immediately softens his voice when he's talking to Fenwick, like, minutes later, and uses sir and stuff like that. I think that both of these instances are good examples that show that while Louis does care for his brother, he seems to care more about playing a role to the point where he represses everything else. Like, okay, he can't look weak in front of his white business partners. Makes sense. But his white business partners weren't around while he's pulling a knife on his brother, were they? I mean, it's not like his business is gonna tank if he has 2 of his employees to quietly remove Paul from Liberty Street or something like that. So basically, I think this distinction is probably the biggest part of Louis' character, which takes us to our central themes. I have chosen schizophrenia, repression, and a bit of extra stuff. The extra stuff is stuff I want to talk about that doesn't neatly fit into either category. Okay, to start, schizophrenia. So, to establish how this applies to Louis, we first have to talk about Paul. If we look at the symptoms Paul shows, he's seen having visual and auditory hallucinations. And it's obviously not specifically named, but we can assume this is some combo of autism slash schizophrenia, probably childhood onset, based on inferences from Grace and Louis' conversation about him. So, the thing about schizophrenia is that based on the current research we have on it, the overall cause on how it occurs is primarily genetic, and it needs 2 or more of these symptoms to diagnose. And yes, I took this from the actual DSM-5. We got delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, and grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior. Other interesting thing about schizophrenia that I think is less talked about is that it needs a trigger to be activated. Basically, if you have the genes for it but you don't show any symptoms, then it can be activated through some kind of event, and whatever event it is seems like it's different for everyone. So how does this apply to Louis, our fictional character from Interview with the Vampire? Obviously we have hallucinations, mostly of Lestat, but the others are less clear because we're seeing the events from Louis' perspective, not what actually happened. I also want to specify I chose specifically schizophrenia, not schizoaffective, depressive, or bipolar disorder, because while we do see depressive episodes, there appears to be exogenous factors, and he doesn't really consistently display mania, and that's not counting his colored-only bit, which felt more like a one-off. As for his trigger, we can see he develops hallucinations almost immediately after Louis thinks he's killed Lestat. So clearly the event was obviously very traumatizing for him, and I'll talk more about Louis and Lestat later, but the interesting bit comes when you ask yourself, okay, so he's got hallucinations, but what about the other 4 symptoms of it? And to that I would like to point you to Season 2, Episode 8, right after Louis escapes the theater and goes to a graveyard. He's starved of blood and basically displaying all symptoms of schizophrenia, and his symptoms get better when he consumes blood. So we can assume part of it is because he's starving, but it also narratively sort of implies that blood is basically really good Thorazine. So, we could argue with the exception of visual and auditory hallucinations, Louis seems to have remission symptoms of schizophrenia. Another part of Louis' schizophrenia is obviously the contents of his hallucinations, which, Lestat. His hallucinations honestly tell the audience more about what he is thinking in relation to a situation, rather than anything to do with Lestat himself. Like in Dubai, we most recently see him dressed in his trial outfit, and this is when Louis is telling Daniel the truth about Claudia's turning, and it sort of feels like he's there to Louis because he's finally taking accountability for what he did to Claudia. But the interesting bit that I don't quite understand the reasoning for is that his eyes are purple. Maybe because Louis knows Lestat is alive, and thus his hallucinations no longer match the real Lestat exactly. Like he's trying to distinguish them or something. Another interesting bit is, when Armand is telling Louis his backstory, he's talking about his experiences being enslaved, and Louis' Lestat hallucination laughs when Armand is describing the cycle of vampires making other vampires, because Louis thinks it's stupid that Armand is trying to find meaning in it. On the topic of this, Louis consistently seems like he doesn't like how Armand is using his background as an excuse to act pathetic. Like, when he gets high in episode 5 after feeding from Daniel, he goes off on Armand and he's like, "My daddy vampire groomed me into a little bitch." So you can tell this is something that he's never really talked about or resolved with Armand, which brings us to our next topic. Repression. This guy has some big repression issues. So to start, we have the obvious stuff. Louis is gay and traditionally Catholic, and those two things historically don't really mix super well. So then there's the aspect of how older gay people, particularly gay men, have a lot of feelings of shame because of men's traditional gender roles in society. And we definitely see this with Louis and Lestat's relationship, especially when he invites Lestat to dinner with his family. And then we combine that with the racism. And we definitely see the repression aspect of this become more noticeable after Louis becomes a vampire. Especially with the scene where he kills that contractor after smiling and nodding while he was being talked down to. This kind of establishes a pattern for Louis, where you can see that one moment he appears to be completely fine with whatever's happening, and then he explodes because he's been repressing whatever's bothering him. We also see this happen with him putting the colored only sign on his brothel, and when he kills Fenwick, who's trying to run him out of business because he's black. This is interesting because there's this big point in episode 3 where Louis doesn't want to kill people because he feels guilty, about murder. But there's a noticeable lack of that whenever he explodes and murders someone. So, I guess murder's okay if he was racist first. Okay, back to the Catholicism stuff real quick. His morals about killing people probably also have roots in how he was raised Catholic, and we can see how this sort of shifts over time as he grows older. I mean, in Dubai, Louis literally says to Daniel that he is having a hand in the divine plan by killing people, and that he can see his victim's entire life as he feeds with all-seeing eyes. So this is basically his justification for killing, but with a fun Catholic twist, I guess. I'll get to this in a second, but he's pretty much like the direct opposite to Lestat. Like, Lestat considers himself a god, not a person executing God's will. But the funny part is that he basically shares Lestat's viewpoint to Daniel, and then he makes sure to clarify that his is the correct one. Anyway, based on this, pre-Paris Louis is probably going to feel guilt for how he blows up and kills people, but once he develops the whole "I'm actually executing God's plan, so it's fine" bit in the second half of season 1, I don't think he cares as much. Another part of Louis' repression arc is his relationship with his mother and sister. When he goes to visit his mother after Paul's death, she blames him for it while simultaneously judging him for being gay. Grace, on the other hand, obviously doesn't blame him at all, and even says he looks like he's doing better after seeing his eyes have changed. I'm assuming that she can see that Louis feels less burdened by his responsibilities after being turned into a vampire, and it shows that Grace still loves him regardless. Their relationship only sours after Louis stops showing up and abandons his nephew on the floor. You know, among other things. The last time we see her is in episode 5, after she's made a gravestone for Louis. You can argue that this is proof of Louis being fully distanced from being human, and that it's impossible for him to have human connections as a vampire, but I think it's more literal in that he hasn't made contact with Grace in years, and she's shunning him because of that, not because he's a vampire. I mean, the death date on the headstone is 1930, when he was turned into a vampire in 1910. At this point, I'd assume that Grace knows he's some kind of supernatural creature, cause, you know. But I think her hangup is more so that Louis abandoned her, and she's giving herself closure by declaring him dead, rather than, you know, vampire. I think Louis cutting contact with his family was probably from a combination of Lestat encouraging him to, and Louis' mother blaming him for Paul's death. Obviously, it would have been way more difficult for him to continue seeing them, especially with the whole "I want to eat my nephew" event. But the reason it was so easy for him to stop was because of how he represses everything, combined with Lestat's completely nonchalant attitude whenever he has a crisis. You know, I love the contrast in Dubai, where on my first watch I thought he had grown as a person and was managing his anger, and also in part because of his poetic mannerisms. And then it turned out he was exactly the same. It's debatable on it if Armand was keeping him calm by, like, editing his memories, or if he was trying to prove he's grown as a person to spite Lestat. Probably a mix of both, and more of the second, I'd say. Alright, on to my extra stuff. I just got like a ton of random stuff that didn't really fit into my two themes, so let's just go through them real quick. So first, in season 1 episode 5, after Claudia leaves, Louis becomes depressed, and we can see that he starts hoarding like newspapers and stuff. I love the insinuation here that before this, Louis did all the cleaning in the house, and Lestat can't be bothered to help him clean with him being depressed, and so it just devolves. Slight side note on the distinction between depression and hoarding disorder, just because I find it interesting. Louis doesn't actually have hoarding disorder because he doesn't have an attachment to the hoard. He just doesn't care enough to throw it out. People with hoarding disorder sort of see their objects as children, or they usually have like this really big emotional attachment to them. Basically a tangential sort of side note, if you're ever cleaning for a hoarder, then don't throw things out unless it's hazardous, because it'll make them worse. Anyway, okay, a second thing. In season 2 episode 8, Louis kills Santiago, and my biggest question here is, how does Louis know his background enough to taunt him with it before he kills him? I don't actually have an answer to this, I'm just pointing it out, but Louis describes like word for word reciting what Santiago says to his maker before being turned. Which, like, okay, badass, but how did you find that out? Is Louis just trying to make himself sound cooler to Daniel? Because that would be funny. He also does the "come to me" thing before killing Santiago, which is a whole other thing by itself. I mean, throughout the series, Lestat says it to Louis a lot. Armand allegedly says it to Lestat in season 2 episode 3. There's a lot of coming in the show. Yeah, anyways, I think the instance with Santiago, Louis is using it more so in a way where he's mocking Lestat. It's just interesting that he's using it on Santiago of all people. Alright, for my third and final extra bit, This is kind of in line with Louis' whole repression bit, in that Louis is a bit of an adrenaline junkie, and he's sometimes impulsive and just says whatever he can to provoke a reaction. Like in Season 2, Episode 5, with his fight with Armand, he calls him boring and the softest, beigest pillow. I mean, this is probably how he actually feels, but it's hilarious to me because in his relationship with Armand, Armand just tries to manipulate him into feeling bad, while when he was with Lestat, he would just scream at him back. I honestly think that in like a toxic yaoi way, that's part of why he became companions with Lestat in the first place, because they just continuously wind each other up. Anyways, speaking of Louis and Lestat, I've prepared a subsection on their relationship. So I see the question of, did Louis love Lestat in Season 1 thrown around a lot when people are talking about the show? So I'm posing this question as a basis for my analysis. In order to figure out the answer to that though, we gotta start at the beginning real quick. So I know I mentioned the Louis threatening Paul with the knife scene, and obviously I'm assuming you've watched this show, because if you haven't, it'd be kind of weird that you're watching this. So, like, cliff notes, Lestat talks to Louis telepathically, and Louis thinks he's the devil. After Paul's death, Louis feels some of that sweet, sweet Catholic guilt, and he goes to a church to confess his sins. And then Lestat's all over the place. No, but seriously speaking, the scene in the church is really cool, and it's probably one of my favorites in the show. You've got this very clear unholy marriage type symbolism thing, and yeah, it's awesome. Anyway, when Louis is in the confession booth, I think he's being honest with what he's saying, where he feels like he has to play these roles to survive and give his family a good life, but they're also in direct conflict with his faith. And we also get the sense that his attraction to Lestat, and Lestat being a vampire, is obviously something that he struggles to reconcile with his morals. Lestat, on the other hand, thinks that Louis' Catholic guilt is humiliating. But that's obviously because Lestat doesn't believe in God, so Louis following a Catholic moral code and feeling guilt or shame from his actions is inherently humiliating to Lestat. It's interesting because with all of these factors, how do we get from point A to B in the span of like 10 minutes, where Louis goes from having a crisis in the confessional booth to completely agreeing to be Lestat's companion? Now, there is the element of Lestat stalking him, and you do kind of get the sense that he's pressuring him into it, but I'd say in this specific moment at the altar, I don't really think that Louis is considering any option besides saying yes to him. I think all of the parts where their relationship works is purely explained in this one scene. Lestat lists all of the roles he plays: stern landlord, deferential businessman, the loyal son, and then he promises that Louis doesn't have to play a role with him. Like, if we contrast this with Louis' relationship with Armand later on, Armand inherently feels like he needs to play a role to get Louis to like him, and I think on some level Louis recognizes this. So basically, the entire reason they even work together in the first place is because Louis feels like Lestat sees him when no one else is able to. I don't remember if there was like an interview with the showrunners, or if it was something I read, but I could have sworn there was like this reoccurring theme mentioned of like, to be loved is to be seen, or something like that. Regardless, I think it applies here. Obviously, there's the aspect of Lestat being able to read Louis' mind before he turned him, which definitely gave him an advantage, but I do think there is some level of understanding between them, even after that. Although that's obviously overshadowed by like a ton of other problems they have. Namely, Lestat thinks being a vampire is great, while Louis does not take well to being a vampire. He basically gets high right after being turned, and then sobers up immediately after killing someone, and then he realizes he still has obligations to his family and business. There's this consistent pattern established where Lestat has this very carefree attitude, while Louis is standing there, traumatized and half-burnt to a crisp, literally and metaphorically. We can see it when Louis has a crisis over almost eating his nephew, while Lestat's like, let's go see an opera. This almost immediately segues into him feeling guilt over killing people. Then he doesn't eat humans and thus doesn't have energy, which leads to Lestat cheating with Antoinette to try and provoke Louis, and Louis cheats on him back. Then we get the iconic line of, "I heard your heart dancing!" No notes, thank you. So basically, when we take all of that into consideration, I think that Louis liked the idea of being with Lestat, but he didn't like the realities of it once he actually experiences them, like having to eventually give up his family and business, and then he grows to resent Lestat. On my first watch through, I didn't really want them to end up together, and I actually liked Louis with Armand more, like in the beginning of Season 2, not afterwards. But with their reunion at the end of Season 2, I'm sort of rooting for their toxic yaoi dynamic. I think I've seen someone describe it as, they're both exactly where they want to be. and I think that's true. So then the question here is Louis' relationship with Lestat going to work any better after they've been separated for 70 years? And to that I say, like, probably not. Louis is less Catholically repressed. Like, he at least acknowledges he's gay now, but he still has the same fundamental beliefs and, like, years of repression that he hasn't done anything about. So I'd say in Season 3, we'll probably get a lot of the same sort of fights, except they have iPhones now or something. I mean, I guess that would make it funnier. Anyways, of course, naturally, we are now on to... Lestat. I once heard someone call him Anne Rice's special boy, and, like, that's the best descriptor. We also have to establish the caveat that we've never actually properly seen Lestat until the end of Season 2, because everything is told to us by Louis and a bit by Armand. This is the same with Claudia mostly, but we'll get to that later. Either way, this is a very Louis-centric assessment of Lestat. So, from the get-go, we know that Lestat is blonde, he's French, and he's loud and dramatic. And I think you're like 80% of the way there into understanding his character with just those 4 adjectives. But since I'm cool, I'm gonna give you some more. So here are our central themes. We've got loneliness, vanity, and my requisite little extra things at the end. So starting with loneliness. Armand has this as well, but it's a lot less direct, and we'll get to that in a minute. So Lestat's fear of abandonment specifically seems to be directed towards Louis. At least that's what is told to us by Louis himself. And Louis threatens to leave Lestat a lot.
That's why you're always gonna be alone.
You're gonna leave me?
I'm nothing without you.
The single worst thing the vampire can feel is loneliness.
So, like, from Lestat's perspective, why keep pursuing Louis if he's continuously threatening him with his worst fear? Back to when Lestat first sees Louis and watches him threaten Paul. With this, I honestly don't think Lestat was consciously aware of the full implications of what he was doing, like with the mind reading and talking to Louis telepathically. It feels more like a love at first sight type thing, at least from his perspective. Obviously later during the trial, Lestat does reflect on how he approached Louis, and he admitted that it was kind of predatory, but I'd say he didn't realize it in the moment. I think the majority of what's going through his head is like his whole vampire romance bit. He's infatuated with Louis, or at least the idea of him, and he's got the kind of vibes of like a teenage girl being like, it'd be so cute if we have our coffins next to each other, teehee. So I think that combo is why he doesn't want to leave Louis, or, you know, have Louis leave him. Louis is also semi-dependent on him as a vampire, because obviously Lestat never goes into any detail about any of the other vampires, and Louis never asks, which I think is part of why Louis never seriously considers leaving him until after Claudia's in the picture. Speaking of Claudia, Louis basically takes advantage of Lestat's fear of him leaving in order to turn her into a vampire, which I think is done out of his own sense of guilt at letting a child almost die from a fire that he provoked a bunch of people into starting. We can see Louis dragging Claudia's body to Lestat and forcing him to make her, so he basically uses Claudia as a bribe, you know, among the 70 other different ways he uses Claudia. Anyways, back to Lestat. Obviously, Louis eventually does leave him after Lestat gets frustrated and drops him. I think, at least at the point of the trial, he does feel genuine guilt and remorse for how he treated Louis, though his main focus is probably on making sure the Paris Coven doesn't kill him. Again, we're not, like, excusing his actions. Like, if anyone did the real-life, non-vampire equivalent of what Lestat did, they'd probably be arrested. So, you know, taking that into consideration. But also his guilt towards Louis by the time the trial came around does show that he has become aware of how his loneliness can cause him to hurt others. And I think that's also part of why he didn't tell Louis that he saved him when Louis came to confront him after the trial. Another question I was considering was, did Lestat kill Paul or influence him into killing himself? Louis asked this specifically in Season 1, Episode 6, and Lestat obviously says he didn't. Honestly, I think he's telling the truth here. I think the simplest and probably correct answer is that Paul thought that he was a burden to Grace and Louis, and then he decided to kill himself so that they could live their lives. It's also shown in the timing when he kills himself, because I don't think Paul was considering how it would end up ruining Grace's wedding, and where if Lestat was influencing him, I think he'd choose a better timing for it. Other thing kinda in line with what I was talking about before is Lestat's viewpoint on how he kills. I think one of the first people we know that he's confirmed to have killed is Lily. I'm pretty sure he kills her to get closer to Louis because she was Louis's confidant. But then in the church, he says he gives death to those deserving. So in line with that, he killed Lily because he didn't think her life would amount to anything. But that's also why he doesn't kill musically or artistically talented people, because he thinks their lives are worth something. But when Louis says he doesn't want to kill people anymore in episode 3, Lestat says that he considers all humans capable of evil if they think God isn't watching. And then he says that he kills randomly and considers it a biological urge. Now, obviously, both scenes impress a contrast between Louis and Lestat, though we're not sure which one he actually believes. I'd say it's most likely the first, because he didn't kill Antoinette in episode 3. The way those two scenes are presented makes me think that one or both of them is Louis specifically changing details to make Lestat seem more in opposition to him. But, you know, with what was told to us, this appears to be how Lestat approaches killing people. So that's cool, I guess. I don't know. Okay, next section. Vanity. We all know that Lestat has an ego the size of the state of Texas, but admittedly it does feel kind of warranted because he's Anne Rice's special boy. And so he's usually going to come out of a storyline being mostly okay. Like, in the way that Louis slit his throat and put him out with the garbage. You know, he was mostly okay. One of Louis' biggest things that he tries to impress onto Daniel is the idea that Lestat is, like, super selfish. He only looks out for himself, etc., etc. While I think that is in part true, in that he's more self-centered than the other characters, he's probably not as bad as Louis is telling it. One of the best ways to discern this is from the trial, because the entire thing was scripted, and so we can both tell exactly what Lestat said, and whenever he went off script, without having to rely on what Louis says. For example, I mentioned this earlier, but Lestat does give a genuine apology for dropping Louis. I don't think it's a pressing concern for him at that moment, you know, because Louis is about to die, but it does seem like he actually wants to make amends with Louis. Of course, Louis interprets this as...
Crossed an ocean because he wanted us dead. And then...
Something real. This is Lestat. What he does. Over and over.
So obviously he's talking about this pattern he's established of Lestat doing something rash, hurting him, Claudia, or both of them, and then apologizing or showing remorse for it. Which from Louis' perspective makes sense, because it kind of fits with his idea of how egotistical Lestat is, but let's read between the lines a bit here. So we can assume that Lestat was contacted by the Paris Coven. I think regardless he didn't want to kill any of them, but by the time the trial came around he could only figure out how to save Louis, and that would have only left Claudia because he'd probably assumed that Madeline would also save herself, and he probably didn't care as much about her anyways because he didn't know her. So I guess that all makes sense. But then Louis goes to see him later at the end of season 2, and he's all like...
I don't like to point out my virtues.
You know, in response to him not telling Louis that he saved him. Which sounds very antithetical to everything that we've been told about him, but I think this probably says more about Lestat's relationship with Armand than anything else. Well, that, and he probably feels guilty for not being able to save Claudia. But with Lestat and Armand, I think Lestat sees Armand as being kind of a pathetic loser, and so his "we'll see how long it holds" type thing after the trial makes it seem like he's pretty confident that Louis would figure it out on his own. But this could also maybe be leftover spite for Louis trying to kill him, though he seemed more impressed than anything at that. Anyway, that's my thoughts on why he'd say that. Another nitpicky thing I thought I'd mention is Louis' comment on Lestat never telling him about the cloud gift before dropping him. He thinks that Lestat not telling him was because he didn't want Louis to feel inferior to him. You see, this kind of sounds good on paper, but the weird part is that Louis already does feel inferior to him. Racially, with his whole repression thing, and as a vampire, like when he gets upset when Lestat keeps calling him a fledgling. Also, I don't know if this is intentional or not, but didn't Lestat use the cloud gift to stand up in the church after killing the priest? And going back to our vanity theme, I don't think it's like a Lestat thing to be humble and hide this from Louis. Another part of Lestat's character that kind of contributes to his ego is his whole thing with religion. Mainly that he doesn't believe in God. We learn this right in episode 1 when Paul presses him about it, and Lestat basically says that he got the Christ beaten out of him at a young age. If we try and piece the timeline together, then it was like right after this that Magnus kidnaps him and turns him into a vampire.
He kept me for a week, locked in a room full of corpses.
The interesting bit is that when Lestat tells this to Louis and Claudia, he also says that he has a capacity for enduring. And I think this kind of goes back to my egotistic Anne Rice's special boy thing, where Lestat on some level knows that he possesses some type of invulnerability. There's that aspect, and then there's the more fun trauma aspect of it, where he's kind of being like, I've been through all this stuff, but I'm still here. Anyways, with the religion thing, I'm pretty sure he believes in an afterlife, just not like a god that's going to punish him like Armand does. And so because of that, and because of what he's been through, he finds the concept of believing in or praying to a god to be humiliating, like what I mentioned before in the Louis section. I think there's some element of superiority to it as well, because he has been in a position where he's done that exact thing and his prayers haven't been answered, and so now he's mocking other people for it. Aside from that, I also mentioned in the Louis section how Lestat considers himself a god, mostly in relation to how he kills people, and the whole Lestat doesn't believe in God bit kind of helps to contextualize that. There's also this fun quote from when Lestat is teaching Louis how to read minds, and he says that humans only think of one of three things.
I want food, I want sex, I want to go home.
This again shows how he considers humans inferior, and supports his viewpoint on himself being a god. This quote is so interesting to me because even in-universe, once we get past this scene, there are so many times where we can see human characters thinking other things than that. Again, this is Louis' retelling of Lestat, but if he did actually say this, then it's probably because he wants to dumb them down in comparison to himself, so he feels less guilt about killing them. Other tidbit I thought was funny that contributes to Lestat's ditzy blonde character archetype is that Lestat doesn't read, like, at all. I don't know if this is an ego thing, if it's because he looks down on humans, or if it's like something he was raised with, but I think it's such a fun character trait for him to have. Last little bit on his ego is when he's trying to get Louis' forgiveness after dropping him. He has Antoinette sing "Come to Me," and he gives it to Louis as a gift, and Louis swims across a river with the record in hand to confront him. I just think his audacity and him knowing Louis well enough to piss him off is just like really funny. That's all. I don't really have any analysis for this part, I just like this scene. Okay, anyways, now for my extra bits. Mostly all I want to talk about here is like post-trial Lestat. So with Lestat and Claudia, we can definitely see that he feels guilty for playing a part in killing her. It seems like the Paris Coven would have tried to kill him if he interrupted the trial, so I guess that makes enough sense. But there are still some unanswered questions. Like, did Armand free Louis from the coffin, or was it Lestat?
I tasted the blood. I knew it was his.
Whose? Homie, whose was it? Obviously he's implying that it was Armand's, and they're both telling it like Armand freed Louis, but literally what motivation would he have to do that? I guess you could argue that a lot of what Armand does is for Lestat's attention. Like, he's already implanted fake memories of the trial into Louis' head, so stealing him from Lestat isn't that difficult. And he also doesn't stop Louis from burning down the theater after he warns him. I honestly think that Lestat freed him, just from the way that he words stuff when we first see him in Season 2, Episode 8, and then Armand just did a lot of memory editing after the fact. Alright, cool. Onto Claudia.
Claudia.
You hadn't done yet.
Claudia. Claudia. I cannot listen to this insanity about Claudia one more time.
So straight up, I'm gonna hit you with a trigger warning for rape. I'm hoping you already know that, because like I'm hoping we've seen the same show, but you know, just putting that one out there because it's important to Claudia's character. So with Claudia, she's just kind of there, was my first thought when trying to figure out how to explain how her character works. Like, most of the major events we have in relation to Claudia are things that happen outside of her control, like with her turning, Bruce, and the play. With the first one, this is intentional because Louis initially uses her as a solution to the problems he has, despite her not solving any of them. Also in the book, she's inspired by Anne Rice's daughter, who died from leukemia. So basically Claudia has to die, or is destined to die, and again, even her purpose in the story thematically is out of her control. Another point is Claudia's diaries. They're pretty important for corroborating Louis' account of what happened, plus it gives Daniel, and by extension the audience, the ability to hear her account without Louis' influence. Anyways, for her themes, I went for placeholder, resentment, and then my extra stuff. So how is Claudia a placeholder? She's used by Louis sort of like an object, and then neglected the moment he gets what he wants.
You and him and you!
This basically established her as always being the second option for Louis, and in this specific scene she's referring to Armand, but I think it's clear that she's also referring to Lestat a bit because of how she's not referring to Armand by name. I wouldn't say that this is like a pseudo-emotional incest thing, but I'm not saying that it isn't. Okay, it probably is. And I say that in the sense of like, Louis is obviously gay, but she fills the role in his life that Lestat and Armand do when they're not in the picture. Like, after they slit Lestat's throat and go to Europe, and it's just the two of them, but again, she's just a placeholder in between them for Louis. Even in other ways, she also acts as a placeholder between Louis and Lestat. I mean, Claudia's turning only happens because Louis killed Fenwick, and then, forced Lestat to turn her. She seems to quickly realize on some level that she's a band-aid for a failing marriage, and inserts herself when Lestat and Louis are fighting, which, again, she's kind of a living placeholder for their marriage problems. Louis also takes on a fatherly role, and immediately starts lecturing her on vampire stuff, despite not having resolved any of these issues for himself. She also immediately has a lot more questions about vampires than Louis does, and this kind of makes her distinct from Louis, and shows how he's not qualified to be answering her questions, since, he doesn't know either. As a result of her being in this placeholder sort of role, for most of her relationship with Lestat, he sort of treats her like a dog. He's jealous of her because Louis basically chooses her over him, again with the weird emotional incest thing. But this culminates in Claudia hating Lestat more than Louis does by the time the trial comes, and she speaks for Louis during that and when attempting to kill Lestat. We see that Lestat does end up regretting how he treated her after she died, and him and Louis do kind of have similar reactions, so they definitely both consider themselves to be her parents. Louis definitely became more dependent on her over time. Like, when the trial is over, he doesn't seem to have any interest in continuing to live because he doesn't have anyone else to live for. Another interesting smidge is that she gains this, brother/sister dynamic to Louis after she grows older, but Louis remembers her as his daughter after she died. I think it's interesting how both Louis and Lestat sort of only remember her as a child, when she tried, really, really hard to present herself otherwise. My other theme for Claudia is resentment. I think the beginnings of this develop almost immediately after Claudia's turning. I mean, she gets turned at 14, so I think on some level her mind recognizes that it's developing, while her body isn't. She's still pretty immature at this point, but it's more so in the sense that her growth is stunted, and she doesn't talk to anyone besides Louis and Lestat, who, treat her like a child. I mean, she figures out what sex is at 18, falls in love with Charlie, and then kills him on accident. And then Lestat doesn't do her any favors because he forces her to watch his body burn. I think this event kind of hits home for her that she's going to look like a child forever, and naturally once she starts to accept that, she starts to resent Louis and Lestat. This obviously culminates in her murder spree plotline in episode 5, because she's trying to make another vampire so she can have a companion. Because by this point I think she's realized that she's a bit of a placeholder for Louis and Lestat, and she probably resents both of them equally for this, and for turning her, because she doesn't know that Louis forced Lestat to do it until the trial. Other thing, Claudia's actress being recasted for season 2 is actually really cool, because I think Bailey Bass gives her more of a childlike appearance, while Delaney Hayes still retains that appearance, but the change makes her character kind of feel more adult, like she's grown up without really growing up, Another sort of power scaling tidbit that I think contributes to Claudia's resentment is something I noticed when she wants to turn Madeline into a vampire. Claudia says she's too small to do it, and I'm assuming this is insinuating that she's crippled as a vampire, and so even though she's gotten older, she hasn't gotten any more powerful because she's stuck in the body of a child. I think if this is true, then it kind of helps to contextualize a couple things. Like, when Claudia leaves in season 1 episode 5 and finds Bruce and he rapes her, she's obviously super traumatized from this, and if we put the whole power scaling thing into perspective, then she's probably about as strong in Paris as she was when Bruce raped her. And I think this contributes to a lot of why she does what she does, and her feelings of resentment to Louis in the Paris Coven. I don't really think Claudia could go off on her own as easily as Louis could, because she's inherently weaker than everyone else, and that leaves her resentful of those around her, and at Louis and Lestat for making her in the first place. We also kind of see this right before she comes back in episode 5.
I spend time following Louis and Lestat now that I am my own woman, with no obvious sense of why I follow them, other than meaning slowly disintegrates without them.
This is when she sees Louis crying in the graveyard after being abandoned by Grace, and then decides to go back to them and be Louis' sister. We kind of get the sense that Claudia also doesn't know how to mentally be on her own without them. Well, mostly Louis, and I think she ends up resenting them for that as well. Another tidbit I didn't really know where else to put is Lestat and Claudia's chess game in episode 6. We can see that she lost a game to him earlier in the episode, but with the second, she leaves instead of officially winning against him because she knows it'll upset him more. I think this is obviously showing that she's resentful of Lestat, but I think it's also in part her testing him a bit. Like, at this point, she already knows she wants to kill him, and so she's almost testing her mental strength against him to see if she'll win. Another thing is this conversation that Claudia and Madeline have, where she's wondering if she chases after things that end up hurting her. Like, she thinks that she's somehow at fault for all the bad things that happen to her, and then she feels resentful and angry, and doesn't know how or what to do with that.
A collision in me, like I want to go back.
It's basically like she's had to take more of a leadership role with leading Louis around Europe while he's moping and hallucinating Lestat, and she resents him for it because she's always been second to Lestat even when he's not around. Then there's also added resentment because now she's actually with the Coven like she wanted, and at the first opportunity they're infantilizing her. Alright, trauma, fun. Now for my extras. This is like completely unrelated to all of my themes, but one of my favorite quotes in the show is when Louis realizes that Claudia can dream, despite her writing in her diary that she couldn't.
She could dream.
I think it's just a very human thing where you have this sort of feeling when you learn something new about a loved one that's passed away. Like, in some ways they're still alive and with you, and yeah, I don't know, I just think that's nice. I mean, we can probably connect this back to how Claudia resented Louis and stuff, but I'm just gonna leave it on its own. Now, I have a smidge of a subsection on Claudia and Madeline. Like, opening thoughts, they have easily the most healthy relationship in the show, and it basically gets utterly trampled within minutes. I'd say it's initially a bit unbalanced because Madeline sees Claudia as a child, but after realizing she isn't, their dynamic becomes more equal. Although not completely, because as we see later, Madeline doesn't have anything else to live for, and Claudia saved her, so she's pretty dependent on Claudia.
My coven is Claudia.
And again, that's why Madeline chooses to die with Claudia. Another, like, resentment-ish thing is that Louis gets upset at Claudia because she told Madeline she's a vampire. I think that even if Claudia wasn't planning on turning her, it is pretty hypocritical of him to get upset, because he's all Claudia has besides the Coven. Anyways, I figured it would be thematically appropriate to end my Claudia section with how she dies.
I now know all your faces. If there is an afterlife, I'm gonna come back and fucking kill all of you.
This is just an awesome line, yeah. Anyway, I wanted to focus on her last words, which are, "Follow the bouncing ball," and then she starts singing "My Baby Loves Windows." For most of my analysis with this, I've used nothing but my own brain, but for this one I googled, and apparently the bouncing ball refers to the animation in sing-alongs where the ball, like, bounces over the words. This is clearly like a mockery / fuck you to the Covenant audience. Like, she wants to intentionally make them all uncomfortable so they know they're complicit in her death. According to both Lestat and Armand, the last thing she sees before she dies is Lestat, and I think that kind of ties all of the themes together that I talked about earlier, where, like, her entire life was sort of out of her control, and even as she dies, she's looking at Lestat, which I feel like she thought would be kind of like a last fuck you to him, but in practice she's probably in so much pain that it ends up being more of a cry for help. Anywho, on to Armand.
I could not prevent it.
This is basically Armand in a phrase. Armand is probably my favorite character, and you can tell because this section is probably going to be the longest. I love all of the silly memes people make of him. Yeah, bro did that, I don't care. Anyways, for his themes, I chose control, passivity, and roles, with a couple subsections. Okay, starting with control. Basically, Armand resigns himself to whatever situation he's in, while at the same time being super controlling. There's like the small stuff where he's immediately arranging Daniel's levodopa transfusions and like contacting his doctor on his behalf. And the subtle stuff, like with the Dubai apartment, you can tell the books are placed high up so Armand can feel useful to Louis. Because, like, we all know that if Louis had an issue with the books being like that, the entire room would already be destroyed. Then we get to the best part of Armand, the lying. This is also an aspect of how he tries to control those around him, because it seems like by lying, he feels like he's able to control whatever narrative he's spinning. One of the silliest ones that happens, like, almost immediately is when he's still in his Rashid costume, And he's lying about his magnolia tree to Daniel when he asks about it. He's all like, oh, this interior designer thought Louis was missing the natural world. And I think in hindsight, that's a stupidly overcomplicated explanation for a tree. Another one I'd like to mention is when Armand starts praying, again while he's still cosplaying as Rashid. I know there's a fair amount of speculation on, like, is Armand genuinely a Muslim? But to me, it feels very Armand to pray as a bit. Although I guess it could also be something he learned before being sold into slavery. Either way, I don't feel like he's actually Muslim, at least in a traditional sense, because it kind of contrasts with how he views, like, the idea of dying or how he kills people. His thought process was probably more along the lines of, Daniel will never be able to guess that I'm secretly a 514-year-old vampire if I say this really culturally specific thing that proves I totally didn't just Google how to pray as a Muslim. Because the bit he does here is apparently not a very widely used phrase and is, like, only used in one specific region. I'm just going to leave a link to a Reddit post that talks about it a bit more because I think it's cool. But I'm not Muslim and am thus not informed enough to be discussing this theme in depth. Honestly, to add on to that, I'd say that Armand's praying bit is also simultaneously him going, look at my niche knowledge of Muslim prayer, and seeing if Daniel picks up on it in, like, a silly, look at my fascinating boy kind of way. And, like, to his credit, Daniel does not drop it. I'd say he's probably doing two things at once here, where, like, he doesn't want Daniel to find out he's not actually Rashid, but he's also, like, interested in the moment and provoking him. Another part where Armand is, like, very obviously lying is when he gets caught putting Fred Stein photographs in with Louis' portfolio, and then when Louis calls him out on it, he's like, why would I do that? We as the audience can tell that he did it simply because there's no other logical explanations for them ending up there, and Armand's excuses about it are, like, also super flimsy. Like, why would their staff have any reason to be touching Louis' photography portfolio? Louis obviously also knows that he did it, and he gets, like, really passive-aggressive about it later, which I think is kind of funny. So then you obviously ask the question, why would Armand lie about something so obvious when he must have known he'd get caught? And I think that was his exact intention, where here we see he's not lying to push a narrative with Louis, he's lying because he knows that Louis will get mad at him for it. Essentially, I think he's provoking an argument with Louis because he's trying to replicate Louis' relationship with Lestat so Louis doesn't leave him. And so he just kind of does random shit like this every once in a while. Again, this is kind of in line with what I mentioned in the Louis section, where Armand feels like he has to play a role for Louis to want him. And in a way he kind of does, but, like, I have a whole section on that, so I'll get to it in a sec. So, in summary, Armand loves lying. It's his Olympic sport. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Anyways, on to our next theme. Passivity. So, like I mentioned in the Lestat section, Armand also has a fear of being alone, but it manifests a bit differently. Like, if we look at his backstory, he's born in Delhi, and then he immediately gets sold by his parents, and then he eventually gets bought by Marius. Like, as a point of comparison, if we look at Lestat's issues with loneliness, he's definitely lonely, but he's not going to be attaching himself to whatever he possibly can because he knows it'll make him unhappy. Now, with Armand has never actually been alone, because first it was the slavers, then the brothel, then Marius, then the Roman Coven, then the Paris Coven, and then Louis. I don't think Armand even knows how to be alone, and this is probably like a trauma response type thing, where even when he's over 500 years old and he's clearly, like, super powerful, he's still just clinging to whatever destroys his last group because he doesn't know how else to live. There's this interesting line in Season 2, Episode 8, where Daniel is asking Armand why he didn't warn the Paris Coven that Louis was coming after them, and Armand responds with,
If I'm not with him, I'm nothing.
Now, like, right off the bat, I believe that current Armand believes this, in the literal sense that he doesn't know who he is without being attached to someone. But I think the real answer for why Armand didn't warn the Paris Coven has more to do with the role he plays with them versus Louis, rather than any attachment he had to them, or lack thereof. From what I can tell, the Paris Coven was the only group Armand was in where he had to assume some type of leadership role, and I think this directly contrasts with his I need to replicate my trauma because I don't know how else to live type mindset. Like, Louis and Armand established some type of weird BDSM dynamic type thing, and I think for Armand, it kind of replicates the master-slave dynamic thing he had going with Marius, and so naturally with all of his trauma, he's going to find that more comfortable than continuing to exist with the Paris Coven. We actually kind of get hints of this as early as Season 1, Episode 2, where Armand's in his Rashid costume saying, "I serve a god, it is my honor to serve," in reference to Louis. This could also be him purely attempting to replicate his dynamic with Marius, because that's the only reference he has for servitude, and so when he's playing his role of Rashid, that's what he defaults to. Anyway, this is also why I believe when Armand turned Daniel, he didn't actually leave him at the end of Season 2, because him doing so would directly contrast the pattern of behavior I've just explained. Even aside from that, if the series keeps going, then I also wouldn't be surprised if Armand moves on from Daniel. You know, assuming he doesn't process his, 514 years of trauma. Which, I hope he does, because that'd be so fun and cool. Anyway, I think a large contributor to Armand's passivity is his views on death. I think that if Armand didn't believe in an afterlife, he would already be dead. But it's the fear of being tortured after death that keeps him alive. I mean, otherwise, why would he be basically torturing himself in these abusive relationships, even after he has the power to get out of them? Generally speaking, he's honestly kind of pathetic. And I mean that in no derogatory way, it's what makes him so fun to watch. He wants to make it seem like he has an evil master plan and he's really just doing shit. Sometimes it feels like he doesn't put more than 5 minutes of thought into his actions, and then I think about whatever hijinks he's done this time and I go, yeah, that was certainly a choice you made there, Armand. This is also combined with the fact that Assad Zaman is 6 feet tall, but they frame a lot of shots to make him look smaller. And it's actually awesome, because then when he's framed normally, he looks more intimidating, and you get more of that inhuman monster type thing. Although that kind of implies that I'm saying that people who are 6 feet tall are inhuman. Which, yeah, sure, I'll take that stance. Anyways, on to my final section. Roles. I've said this before, but Armand is the direct opposite to Louis with roles. He enjoys playing a role, or if not enjoyment, then he feels comfortable doing it. If Louis felt stifled by his roles, Armand does not know how not to be playing them. And I've already gone over how he tries to figure out what his current group or companion wants, and then tries to be that, and how he doesn't live life to enjoy himself, but for the base need of survival, which means he puts up with a ton of stuff that most people wouldn't. I think a lot of my points in this section are a bit all over the place, because I'm also pointing out certain traits that Armand displays that I also think are roles, because as it stands, I don't think Armand has much of a sense of self. Given that, I think a lot of the opinions that he expresses throughout the interview are things that he's picked up from other characters, and I'm hoping that we'll see if that's true in Season 3. Anyways, I think when you first think of Armand and roles, you probably immediately go to Louis' line in Season 2, Episode 5, where he mocks Armand with that gremlin or good nurse line. This is probably Louis' interpretation of some of the stuff I discussed before. Armand was definitely playing a bit of a gremlin role to Louis when he put the Fred Steins in his portfolio and tried to lie to him about it. And the good nurse is probably referring to times when Armand tries to manipulate him after he blows up on him. The usage of the word gremlin is interesting to me though, because I remember hearing that Daniel compares him to a giant insect in the books, and so I wonder if they're kind of referring to the same thing. Another interesting thing is that when Louis is introducing Armand, he says, "He looked like a boy masquerading as a gentleman, but I sense his ancient power right away." This is kind of a weird line to apply to, 6 foot tall Armand, but I know there's this whole thing in the books where Armand was turned way younger than he is in the show, and he gets compared to a cherub and stuff, so I'm assuming that's what that's from, but I've put it in the roles section because I think it's a strange thing to apply to show Armand. Louis also mentions to Daniel that he starts doing photography in Paris, and Armand comments on this with,
Vampires with hobbies. Insanity.
he thinks that hobbies are a human thing. This also kind of feeds into the role thing, because while I genuinely do think that Armand believes what he's saying, he's also simultaneously the one who thought that Lestat was cool for turning his coven into a theater troupe. So the theater itself is also really interesting, because when Louis introduces them, he calls the plays weird and ending in death or cruel, barely motivated violence, while Armand defends them as timeless. So I think based on that, even in Dubai, Armand seemed to be proud of the plays he directed, and this probably indicates that he does on some level genuinely enjoy the displays of violence in them and the process of making and directing them. Anyway, I don't think this entirely qualifies as a hobby, though it might for a vampire, but I just thought it was funny how Armand seems to believe one thing and then does another. Completely other random little role thing. You know how in Season 2, Episode 8, Louis and Armand list all the places they've been to since they left Paris? They specifically mention Egypt, New York, San Francisco, and then Dubai. And okay, that's cool and all, but then why does Armand have a British accent? Louis kind of makes sense with how his accent changes, but like, why is Armand suddenly British? Does Louis get unnerved when he does the French accent? Like, Armand thinks it reminds him too much of Lestat or something, and so he just tried to force himself into becoming British. I don't know, that's my headcanon right now, because I think that'd be funny. Anyways, at this point I've gone over how Louis and Lestat kill, so how about Armand? He finds someone half in love with an easeful death, which basically means he makes his victims suicidal before killing them. It's unclear if he actually goes out of his way to kill people who are just like normally suicidal, or if he talks all of them into it. I'm assuming the second based on the episode where he hunts down Malik. Other interesting bit is at the very beginning of episode 8. Louis describes being in the coffin as a quiet, easeful death, and Armand's like, you actually screamed a whole lot. I think this could sort of be another example of Armand doing his roles thing, where he believes two opposing things at once. Because he seems to believe he's justified in giving these people an easeful death, but then when he's talking about Louis in particular, he recognizes that the easeful death that Louis is describing has very little to do with actually being easeful. More like agonizing death or something like that. Anyways, I've created a couple subsections. So first is Lestat and Armand's. Armand mostly talks about Lestat in relation to him destroying the Paris Coven. He talks about Lestat's prophetic vision, which is basically just vampires adhering less strictly to the great laws and walking among humans. Also, the usage of the word prophetic here is really funny to me, because it's basically like Lestat considers himself a god and Armand believes him. As a sort of contrast, he describes himself as Satan's fool for 239 years, and I think this sort of aligns with Armand's fear of death, where he doesn't really have anywhere else to go, and he also doesn't really believe in the Roman Coven's teachings, but he follows them anyways because he doesn't know what else to do. This is also why he became so interested when Lestat appeared, because he was able to do what Armand felt like he couldn't. I think the main point here is that Armand thinks Lestat is cool.
They were all in love with him. He had that effect on everyone.
I would say that's mostly just you, Armand. Armand also says that he does the come to me thing, and Lestat rejects him. I think Armand is just making stuff up and is telling a parallel to Louis and Lestat's relationship because he's pathetic like that. Like, honestly, I'd take most of what he says about Lestat as Armand writing fanfiction in his head. Lestat telling Armand that he is nothing is probably true, but the context surrounding it is dubious. I'm going off of vibes here, but I don't think he managed to freeze everyone on the street and telekinetically throw Lestat against a wall. Not because he isn't powerful enough to do so, but more so because he's currently playing the role of the Paris Coven leader, and one of their biggest rules is to not show themselves to humans, which he was doing before he froze time. I feel like it'd be more likely that he kidnapped Nikki without humiliating Lestat first, and then Lestat goes to confront him in the Coven. Otherwise, I think Lestat would have been more active in his defense of Nikki, purely because he's Anne Rice's special boy, and Armand is like a tiny, small, pathetic gremlin. I also don't think Armand was leading him into destroying the Paris Coven. I think it's just another example of his passivity, where he doesn't really know what he wants, and so he sort of just allows things to happen to him. He also says that some of the members of the Paris Coven committed suicide, and like, Armand totally killed those dudes, right? Like, I'm assuming at this point he stepped out of his original role as Coven leader, wanted to follow Lestat, and retroactively wanted to make it seem like this was his plan all along. Because, again, Armand thinks that Lestat is cool. Anyways, another question I have is, who organized the interview? I would say it's debatable on whether Armand orchestrated Louis finding out what happened in Dubai, or just let it happen. When Daniel asks about the timing of the interview, Louis says the world, circumstances, and himself have changed, which is why he chose to invite Daniel to Dubai. This kind of sounds like bullshit to me, to be honest. I think the timing has more to do with Daniel than with Louis. Like, back to Armand at the beginning of the interview, at this point he's still playing Rashid, and he tells Daniel he can't outsource his work, that it's not part of the agreement he signed, yada yada, and Daniel steamrolls over him. This is basically Armand losing control over the situation almost immediately, and I don't think he really anticipated Daniel being as assertive as he is. He starts making ominous comments to Daniel, like this scene where he says he's chronicling a suicide. I'd say that Armand does not want this book to actually be published, and if he was the one who organized the interview, then he clearly wants something else from Daniel. Alternatively, though, I do wonder if Louis got bored of Armand or threatened to leave him again, and Armand's attempt at putting a band-aid on their failing marriage was to bring Daniel to Dubai to record Louis' life story again. I don't know, I just don't think Armand thought that Daniel would expose him for being responsible for the trial when he got there. Maybe as more time passed, but probably not initially. It kind of maybe seems that he followed Daniel's career, but not him personally, and so he doesn't know him as well anymore. Like, when he reveals himself and sits in on the interview at the beginning of Season 2, I think he kind of wants to have his cake and eat it too, so to speak. Like, he wants Daniel to struggle the same way he did in San Francisco, and he gets frustrated when he figures things out. I think he revealed himself at the end of Season 1 because Daniel was already figuring out that he was there at Polynesian Mary's, and he knew that Louis was going to talk about him eventually. Though I think he honestly just does shit, and then he gets surprised by the consequences of his actions. I think he probably originally intended to blend in more while playing Rashid, but in the moment started impulsively just doing things that implicated himself. There's also that line he feeds Louis that he repeats in Season 2, Episode 5.
I could see you were partial to him. I preserve your happiness even when you don't or can't. I had a hunch Daniel might prove fruitful in later times.
I think this also kind of supports the Armand organized the interview theory, if for no other reason than that Louis' brain looks like Swiss cheese with how many holes Armand's poked into it. Like, overall, it kind of seems like the original intention of the interview was to have Armand hide the entire time, and then have Louis turn Daniel into a vampire.
I'd give it to you now.
I think this is a pretty indicative scene of this being true, because Armand's like looking up all hopefully, and then he has to be excused when Daniel says no. So Armand probably organized it, and then made Louis think it was his idea, because he didn't want Daniel to die. Because then there's the whole repulsed me, repulses me bit he does. I'd say there are a few interpretations of this, but the one I'm going with is that Armand believed at one point that making a vampire was repulsive, no longer believes that, and also doesn't really want Daniel knowing that his beliefs have changed, but is doing a very poor job at hiding it. Like, he does that facial tic / grimace thing when he corrects himself, which, like, crazy good acting, by the way. These actors are so fucking talented, dude. Anyways, this seems to me like Armand has a backup option in case Louis doesn't or can't turn Daniel. Alright, for my last Armand section, I want to talk about Louis and Armand, specifically their couples act at the start of Season 2. I think this is done by Armand in reaction to him realizing that Daniel's actually good at interviews now, and is finding out a bit too much for his comfort. Like, we can see this in the first interview that Armand is actively part of. The moment he starts to add on, Daniel immediately cuts him off, and he's again not in control of the situation. Though, there's also the aspect of, like, Armand's pathetic enough that he might be trying to make Daniel jealous, despite Daniel not even having memories of him, you know, if we go book Devil's Minion route. Obviously they're doing it to present a united front against Daniel, and go, look how in love we are, but it still reads the other way a bit too. This is hilarious as a concept to me, because it kind of seems like the basis of their relationship is purely for Louis to spite Lestat. I honestly don't think they're compatible, but they try to be out of spite for other people. You know, mostly just Lestat. And I say that because of the little comments that Armand makes in particular. Like, he says he's been with Louis 47 more years than he did with Lestat. And I love him offhandedly pointing this out, like he feels like he's one-upping Lestat, and he's like super proud of himself for it. Then there's this bit where he conversely gets upset about Louis hallucinating Lestat. Like, he's in a one-sided competition for Louis' affections. Like, it's been 70 years, dude, let it go. And then there's also the part in Season 2, Episode 5, when Louis burns himself in the sun. Armand calls Louis' relationship with Lestat insanity, and says that all he had to do was ask if he wanted to leave. And then he basically calls Lestat and repeats what he says, until Lestat says that he loves Louis, and then Armand breaks the connection. I think this is Louis' interpretation of the memory, but if we assume his interpretation of Armand's words is true, Armand is basically going, look at how much better I am for you, and oh, should I call Lestat right now so you can tell him you want him back? Which is objectively hilarious to me. So, back to the interview. When Armand reveals himself to Daniel, one of the first things he says is, Louis can sometimes act out. I protect him from himself. And I think with the added context we have, it's kind of like Armand's making it seem like he's doing Louis a favor when he's just basically acting like a leech. And then there's also the connotations of Armand playing this housewife or even parental role to Louis. Like, in saying that he acts out, it's kind of the language you use when disciplining a child. So maybe it's like an age thing, since Armand is so much older than him. Oh yeah, another bit with their couples act. It doesn't even work all that well because Louis gets annoyed with him almost immediately for interjecting, and then he tries to pretend to Daniel that he isn't annoyed at him, which is really funny to me. Then there's also the bit with Armand's whole "I will not harm you" thing, which I don't even know if I have to explain that one. I think the dramatic irony speaks for itself. Well, let's like contextualize that dramatic irony a bit by talking about the end of the interview and like the destruction of Louis and Armand's marriage.
He loved you a great deal.
I love the look on Armand's face here because I feel like he's happy he was able to get through the interview without Daniel calling bullshit, and he's like reveling in it. I mean, look at his stupid face. And we can notice how visibly tenser he gets as Daniel asks more questions. So then, why didn't either of them read Daniel's mind in this scene? They've proven on multiple occasions that both of them can read his mind. Like, during this scene in Season 2, Episode 2, there's this theory that Armand fed Daniel too much of his blood, and now he can't read his mind, but he's clearly doing it here. So I would say there's two options. Either Armand can read his mind and is doing nothing to prevent him from revealing what happened, or Armand is willfully not reading his mind in this scene and then is blindsided by it. It could be that I've been completely wrong this whole time and that Armand orchestrated the entire thing. He wants Daniel to expose his sham of a marriage so that he can leave Louis without actually admitting to what he did. And then he can attach himself to Daniel, and that's been his master plan the whole time. Nah, I think he's just not reading his mind here for whatever reason. Like, Armand is barely hiding a smile even after Daniel pulls out Sam's copy of the trial script. So I really don't think he could tell what Daniel was about to do. Thus, I think the second is more likely, because Armand likes putting up a front of being cool and mysterious, but he does kind of just do shit at times. Yeah. Also, just like a quick tidbit about the imagery in the Dubai apartment, because I don't know where else to put this. Louis calls it his coffin in the first episode, and we can see that it becomes brighter in color after Armand leaves. And I love this from Daniel's perspective in Dubai in Season 1, because there are a lot of things that don't align with how Louis presents himself, but it seems like he's deliberately trying to hide some of those aspects, so it's harder for Daniel and, the audience to tell that Armand lives there. Like, the Dubai apartment is basically just a technologically advanced modernist coffin with scary paintings on the walls. Definitely just screams Louis Dupont du Lac. Alright, on to Daniel Boy. Specifically old Daniel, because that's mostly what we see of him. He basically acts as the audience insert for the first 2 seasons. Like, that's his primary role in the story. But for him as a character, I have chosen the themes of addiction, willpower, and a couple extras. So for addiction, obviously right off the bat, we know that Daniel has struggled with addiction to drugs in the past. Like, we can see in flashbacks he's doing cocaine and stuff. I think how addiction applies to his character goes further than that, though. We can see this best with the interview.
He wants you in pieces for the privilege of putting them back together as he sees fit.
It's his job.
It's his drug.
I mean, Armand specifically calls it his drug, and I don't think he's wrong. And for Armand, he wants Louis to end the interview right there, probably because he can tell that Daniel will eventually find out about the trial. Again, because it seems like he's sort of addicted to the thrill of finding these things out. And we can see this proven in Season 2, Episode 8.
77 years based on a seismic lie!
Like, his tone of voice here is very triumphant, and for lack of a better term, it's kind of like he's getting off on being right about proving that Armand was lying. Almost to the point that he doesn't really care about anything else. Like his health and safety. We can assume he probably went to Dubai in the first place because he didn't think he had anything left to lose. Like, the idea of, I'm gonna die soon anyways, might as well figure out what this was all about. That's not to say that he wants to die. He's not directly suicidal. I think that even before he starts remembering San Francisco, he also sort of goes into the interview with the idea that he was able to survive the first one, and so he thinks he can survive the second, despite not remembering how he survived. So he's pretty impulsive, and even more so this is emphasized by when he didn't get out when Raglan James told him to at the end of the interview. I think this again points to his whole addiction theme. He probably stayed with Armand because he had more questions, like he's addicted to finding out more information. And when Louis tells Armand not to harm him, Daniel on some level has to know that that doesn't hold much weight, since Armand is more powerful than him. But regardless, he stays because that's more important to him. Anyways, the second theme I chose was willpower. Right from the very beginning of the show, we can already tell that one of Daniel's defining character traits is that he doesn't like being controlled. Like, even with the small stuff, in episode 4, he gets access to Claudia's diaries, and when Armand says to start reading from the left, he immediately goes to the right. And I mentioned this earlier, but there's also this aspect of how he consistently talks over Armand and doesn't listen to him, primarily because he can tell he has something to hide. I think Armand is blindsided by this, mostly because of the difference we see between Daniel when he was younger versus the present. I'd say that younger Daniel does have willpower, but I think older Daniel has developed it more, which is why he's able to get through the interview as he does. I think the most interesting plotline that Daniel has is in Season 2, Episode 5, where before this we get a sense that Daniel is very secure and sure of his identity, and then remembering these memories kind of makes him reconsider who he is. I mean, he tells Louis that he went to Polynesian Mary's because it was a good place to score, so I assume he forgot he was gay, presumably because, Armand. Speaking of Armand, and on the subject of Daniel's willpower thing, Armand tries to make young Daniel half in love with an easeful death by telling him his life doesn't matter because it ultimately won't amount to anything. But Daniel does his bright young reporter with a point of view line. So, two things with this. First, I'd say this shows that young Daniel does have a decent amount of willpower, in the sense that he's resisting Armand trying to make him suicidal. But second, where does bright young reporter with a point of view come from, if not from Louis or Armand? I thought Louis only talks to him and says the line after Armand tries to kill him. Like, in Dubai, Daniel goes and grabs his memoir and says that he thinks that Louis' speech is what kept him a journalist. And I guess we could assume that Louis said the line first, and Daniel's misremembering the timeline and said something else to Armand. Because I couldn't find any other instances before this, but I might have overlooked something. Anyways, another example of older Daniel's willpower during the interview is the way he responds to Armand talking about what he did in San Francisco. Daniel, I think, pretty consistently speaks his mind. He calls bullshit on Armand, saying that Louis asked him to erase his memories in San Francisco, and stands up for himself when Armand is flippant on erasing his memories. This is important when you take into account the power dynamics at play here, where Daniel has had both of them try to kill him at separate times. Like, Daniel is genuinely scared of Louis, and we first see this pretty prominently when Louis takes control of Daniel's body, because he's asking about the pages of Claudia's diary where she writes about being raped, and in Season 2, Episode 8, when Daniel is literally shaking after Louis throws Armand into a wall and then goes to tell Daniel to leave. Obviously Daniel shakes because of the Parkinson's, but I think this one was more pronounced on purpose to show that he's pretty freaked out by Louis. So I think taking all of that into consideration, the fact that he's just being sarcastic and speaking his mind is pretty indicative of how he's grown from the flashback we see of him in Season 2, Episode 5. Anyways, on to my extras. I have a pretty small section here, so let me just run through them real quick. Daniel's an asshole. In his flashback sequence, Armand comments about how Daniel sexually assaulted a girl, and he obviously has no reason to lie about this because he's fishing this stuff directly from Daniel's head. I think this just kind of hammers home that none of these characters are innocent or good people, with the exception of Madeline and maybe Claudia. But I think that's part of what makes this show so good, because if they were good people, then it wouldn't be nearly as fun to watch them. Anyways, next is, in terms of Daniel's family, we know that Daniel has 2 daughters and 2 marriages. I'm pretty sure his daughters' names are Katie and Lenora, because we see that he writes those names down on a napkin in Season 2, Episode 3, and we get a better look at it in Season 2, Episode 5. With his marriages, there's a popular theory about Alice, but I'll get to that in the next section. Anyways, my point here is with Daniel's daughters. We obviously know nothing about them, but God, I really hope we see them in season 3 and Daniel has to like grapple with telling them that he's become a vampire. I really hope he learns from Louis a bit and just tells them outright instead of avoiding them, because that would be way more fun. Last thing relating to the books. Apparently Anne Rice didn't like Daniel to the point where she misspelled his name like multiple times in the books, which is like really funny to me. And I've heard that in the show, his character was combined with David Talbot, and I think he was another vampire interviewer. Main point here though, one of the things I'm most excited for in season 3 is that old Daniel is not in the books, and thus I cannot be spoiled. Okay, and now we're on to sort of spoilers for season 3, because most of this is my speculation and secondhand info from the books. So if you're not interested in spoilers, then shoo. You probably know this already, but Devil's Minion is the ship name for Armand and Daniel, because it's referencing a chapter in Queen of the Damned. That's actually the only part I've ever read from any of the books. So let's start with the good parts about Devil's Minion. The ship name is awesome. I've honestly never heard of a better ship name, because it just thematically fits them both super well, and it's not just like a boring combination of their names. I think the idea is that Daniel and Armand got together in the 70s, Daniel begged to be turned into a vampire, and then Armand erased his memories instead. Because the books are set in the 70s, and Armand actually does turn him into a vampire, and then he goes insane because he can't handle it. At least that's what I've heard. The basis that we have for Devil's Minion in seasons 1 and 2 is mostly just how shady Armand acts. And then there's the other bit with Daniel's first wife, Alice, where the prevailing theory is that Alice is a real person, but all of the stuff about himself that Armand couldn't erase from Daniel's memory, he redirected onto Alice. The first we hear of Alice is when Louis mentions that Daniel proposed to her in Paris. I'm assuming Louis knows this because he read Daniel's book, but this could be Armand that Daniel's proposing to. I feel like Paris is a pretty significant place for him, so it would make sense if it was him. Though the scene that gets analyzed the most is the one when Louis starts reading Daniel's mind to pressure him. He mentions a purple dress that Alice wore, and Daniel responds with,
I like the way she walked in it. She was confident.
To hold her hand.
because what we can infer from this is that he was about to say, I liked the way she looked in it, but if we're running with the Armand is Alice theory, then Daniel can't actually remember the way she looked in it, and he realizes this as he's speaking and says walked instead. God, I love this show. Anyways, Louis talks more about Alice, and yet the first face that comes to Daniel's mind is Armand's, and then he starts remembering more of San Francisco. And the crazy fucking part is where Louis is saying, and what did she say when you finally asked her to marry you? And as he's saying this, Daniel's turning his head towards Armand, which, you know, could mean nothing. I feel like Armand tries to redirect the conversation back to the interview, maybe not to spare Daniel's feelings, but because he wants to prevent Daniel from remembering. And then we get the banger line of, she wanted to say yes, but she didn't trust you. You hadn't given her a reason to. And how does Armand know this? Because he was Alice in the memory. Armand not trusting him would probably refer to Daniel's drug addictions at that point, if we, read between the lines a bit. Louis also offers to read Alice's mind from afar, but Armand is the one who steers it back towards the interview, probably because he knows that Louis would totally go and read Alice's mind at a moment's notice to traumatize Daniel, and then, have the potential to realize that Alice was not the one in Daniel's memory. This would be really embarrassing if we get to, season 3 and there's none of this shit mentioned. But come on, this is the funny themed gay vampire show, so, they gotta do it. Anyway, I'd say the book Devil's Minion was a bit in my uninformed opinion, because it is sort of predictable, because Daniel was in his 20s. You see a smidge of this in Season 2, Episode 5, where they have a pretty unbalanced power dynamic, because Armand can basically make him do whatever he wants. And I'd also like to go back to his whole, you're going to teach me how to be fascinating bit.
You're going to teach me how to be fascinating.
Maybe this is part of what actually could have happened when Daniel was trying to convince Armand not to kill him, not the bright young reporter with a point of view line. He's saying, yeah, I'll teach you how to be fascinating, as a way of, begging for his life. And then Armand edited it out because it kind of segued into the rest of their relationship. Either way, I'm curious to see how they'll have that play out in season 3, because now that Daniel is older, it becomes much more interesting because he's on more even footing with Armand, and that dynamic is cool. So, what are the bad parts about Devil's Minion? We're probably not going to see a lot of it in season 3, and that's it, thanks. No more notes. Alright, so now I have my sort of predictions for season 3, and basically everything else that didn't fit into my other sections. So I initially wanted this video to be completely done about 2 weeks before the first episode of the Vampire Lestat came out, but I started writing my notes for it, and my notes ended up being like 40 pages long, so I guess I have a lot more to say with this show than I first thought. So I was planning on doing a bingo card for season 3, but I wanted to fill out after I finished my notes, and that didn't happen. And I'm still gonna do it, I just don't have time to fit it in this video. Oh yeah, for the bingo card itself, I have made the softest, beigest bingo card. And so while I don't have all my predictions done, here's the card itself if you're interested. Maybe I'll make another video with my predictions and like reaction to the first episode or something like that. I don't know. It depends on how I feel, I guess. But added bonus to this coming out a bit late is that, walk with me here for a moment, there was a prop auction for Interview with the Vampire in February where they auctioned off a ton of set pieces from season 1 and 2, and a ton of people didn't pick up their lots, so the auction house organized a second auction for them, which was done on May 31st, and I was able to pick up a painting from that. It's a reproduction painting of this piece called Sunset Navarro Ridge, California Coast. Very riveting title, I know. I got it for like €6, probably because like, look at it. But I'm happy because it's cool to have something from the set, and I can like put it on my wall and stare at it. Anyway, you might have also noticed that all the clips I used have time codes and subtitles on them, and I did that on purpose, so if you're interested in like counter-analyzing me, then I've hopefully helped with that a bit. While I've been trying to crank this out, I haven't looked at any of the new trailers and stuff because I was worried it would influence my analysis. So for the Vampire Lestat, here's what I know. I just wrote like 4 bullet points, and that's it, to be honest. Okay, so apparently we're gonna have a lot of Akasha, the Queen of the Damned. We see that Lestat says that he has the blood of Akasha in him at the end of season 2. So she's apparently like the vampire queen, pharaoh, something like that. I don't know if I really see her as being the antagonist to Lestat though, since she apparently gave him her blood. So maybe the big plotline will be that great convergence thing they were talking about, and then they all have to team up like Scooby-Doo style to stop it. Because vampires being overlords over humans bad, right? I think the thing I've heard the most about is the incest plotline with Lestat's mother. Like, I'm pretty sure they're making out in one of the trailers. I feel like there already is some weird pseudo-incest themes, like with the vampire fledgling stuff, so it's not super surprising. Okay, no, wait, it kind of is. I don't think I've ever watched a show with just straight-up incest in it, if I'm honest. I got a lot to look forward to. Another thing is that Lestat has a Spotify now. Like, they released Longface a couple months ago, and I've seen people comparing it to a little bit Alexis from Schitt's Creek.
I'm a Lamborghini. I'm a Hollywood star. I'm a little bit tipsy when I drive my car.
And, like, they really do have the same vibes. The only one I've actually been listening to is Butterscotch Bitch. That one's pretty good, I'd say, but the rest are Oh, I actually like All Fall Down a bit, but I feel like it's too short. To me, they're kind of like songs where the first time I listen, I think they're boring, and then they're like mildly enjoyable after that. Not Butterscotch Bitch, though. I like that one. Anywho, cool. I also wrote another bullet point that just says bowling ? I think Daniel goes bowling. Pretty sure we already know that from the trailers. I think it would be funny if Lestat, Louis, Daniel, and Armand all have to meet in a bowling alley for some unrelated thing, and then Daniel just forces them all to bowl. Alright, that was pretty much all I could think of off the top of my head, and I'm not going any further because I still need to, like, edit all of this together. So I'd like to end this video on a high note with my favorite interview with the vampire meme. And that is this. I don't know this person. I've never interacted with them. I was looking for something on twitter.com one day and I found this. And sometimes you read things that you cannot unread. And I think I've made my peace with that. Okay, bye.
And that's the end of it. There's nothing else.